Hello, everyone. Sorry about that delay. We were having some technical difficulties. We're just going to put the slide up now and get started in about 2 seconds.
So, good morning, everybody. My name is Rachenda Van Leeuwen. I'm the Managing Director for Empowering Clean Economies at the Rocky Mountain Institute. We apologize for the delay in getting going with the webinar this morning due to some unforeseen technical issues, which can happen even here in the United States. So we want to thank you all very much for joining us this morning. And we're going to get going right away to make sure that we make the best use of everybody's time. We have a lot to get through this morning. I want to just introduce our panelists this morning, who are Justin Locke, who is our Senior Director, who oversees our work in small island developing states here at IRMA. David Gums, welcome David, who is the former CEO of Anguilla Electricity Corporation, and we'll talk about some of his experiences having lived through hurricanes in Anguilla, as well as his work to help build devastated island economies, and Owen Lewis, who is RMI's operations manager, who is managing many of the aspects of our ongoing work here in the Bahamas. Next slide, please. Just to talk through our agenda a little bit this morning. Just to say that we will be covering RMI's previous calls to action based on our prior work after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which devastated other islands in the Caribbean previously. We will be talking about what we are already doing in the Bahamas, how this devastating hurricane has really affected the humanitarian context, and updates on the humanitarian side, which is really where the response is starting right now, and then moving forward a little bit also to RMI's immediate response and our work with our partners at the Caribbean Association of Utilities, as well as our longer term planning and development for resilient projects to help build back both in the Bahamas and more broadly. So without further ado, I'd welcome Justin Locke to talk through the call to action. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Lucinda, and thank you for joining. And just for everyone, in terms of logistics, if you do have any questions during the webinar, we ask that you hold those and present those through the submit those through the chat. My colleague Katie Lau will be consolidating those comments, and we will leave about 30 minutes at the end to address those. So as Rachenda said, the focus of this webinar is to talk a little bit more broadly about RMI's efforts in the region, really drill down into the Bahamas, and obviously the focus is around the northern Bahamas of Abaco and Grand Bahama, who took a direct hit from Hurricane Dorian on September 3rd. Just some quick facts there. I know many of you are well aware of the devastation and the impact. Dorian caused a 25-foot storm surge across Abaco Island on the late evening of September 2nd, followed by 185-mile-plus-hour winds generated by Dorian, and that hit the devastation was concentrated in Great Abaco, but then also Grand Bahama took a direct hit with the Cat 5 wind speeds. We do have reports yesterday from both SEDEMA and CARELEC, the regional institutions with a mandate for recovery, that on Abaco, 90% of infrastructure has been completely destroyed. On Grand Bahama, most of the T&D is completely destroyed. The generating capacity is still intact, although that was also compromised. On Abaco, the generating facility, which is in both islands 100% diesel, was significantly compromised, and there may be a capabilities to get one back online. Now, we want to make it very clear that we are currently in a humanitarian phase. I think that many of you have seen the reports that the death toll is rising as we speak. Unfortunately, most of that is directed towards the poor population, which primarily comprised of Haitian undocumented immigrants. IRMA is not a humanitarian organization, and we would recommend that everyone channels their inquiries, if you want to get involved in the humanitarian phase, to www.bahamas.com/relief. We also know that SEDEMA has the regional mandate in the Caribbean for the relief phase and understanding the impacts. And then our partners at CARELEC, which Richinda mentioned earlier, the Regional Utility Association, has a mandate for deploying emergency linesmen to restore emergency power. Zooming back about two years now, and many of you are well of Hurricane Irma and Maria. Both Cat 5 hurricanes that hit the Caribbean, several Caribbean countries within 2 weeks of each other. Impacts were seen in Dominica, significant impacts in Barbuda as part of Antigua and Barbuda. Obviously, Puerto Rico is well known, USVI, and British Virgin Islands. Following the devastation that we saw there, what was underscored in the late recovery, early rehabilitation phase was that the significant impacts to these islands, in addition to obviously the humanitarian impact, was the loss of electricity for several days, if not months. That was rooted in the system architecture that is characteristic in the Caribbean, of a centralized diesel generation with long transmission and distribution lines, where the farther you are from where power is being generated, the more likely you are to receive a disruption. Obviously, this system architecture that was replicated from developed countries is inherently vulnerable to disruption, particularly with high wind events such as Irma and Maria. Following the humanitarian and recovery stage, RMI supported several islands in redesigning the electricity system to be more resilient, where the core criteria in the redesign process was resiliency as well as least cost. And through supporting countries such as Barbuda, British Virgin Islands, now in US Virgin Islands, as well as in Puerto Rico, and providing also back-end support to the Clinton Foundation in Dominica, we learned through going through that process that distributed decentralized generation, where generation is closer to load, where you don't have long transmission distribution lines, coupled with renewable energy that isn't reliant on other external infrastructure such as roads, bridges, ports for the import of fuel, is much more more resilient system architecture than a centralized fossil fuel. An example of that is in British Virgin Islands, all the generation capacity was concentrated in Tortola, and that fed 11 other islands through submarine cable. And obviously, those submarine cables were compromised, and the other 10 islands lost power as well. And so we supported the British Virgin Islands in developing a strategy known as the National Energy Transition Strategy that put BVI on a pathway towards a more decentralized, lower cost, more resilient pathway. In addition to that, supporting countries like Puerto Rico with collaborative around their renewable portfolio standards, as well as in Barbuda, rebuilding, redesigning the system and rebuilding that to be more resilient. We're happy to announce that with the support of New Zealand, as well as United Arab Emirates, that system in Barbuda is now being constructed to be high penetration renewable. Moving to the next slide. Following the hurricanes in 2017, one thing that we realized was that if we are going to move towards a renewable future, these assets have to be designed and constructed to withstand the future impacts. And we analyzed several systems in the region that had taken a direct impact from Irma and Maria, some of which had failed and were significantly compromised, and others that had survived, to better understand how we can design and construct these assets in the future to be more resilient. The culmination of that analysis was a report known as Solar Under Storm that provides best practices and guidelines for designing and constructing ground mount solar PV systems to withstand Cat 5 hurricanes, which we think is critical so that after these types of events, countries don't move back towards diesel because these assets are compromised. And as an antidote to that, we have David Gums here, former CEO of Anglec, who had a 1 megawatt solar PV project that was completely destroyed, and some of the lessons learned from that as we look to rebuilding for the future.
Good morning, everyone. My heart goes out to all those affected by Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. I've had the unfortunate experience of surviving Hurricane Irma in 2017. After experiencing 6 hours of continuous 200 or 180 to 230 miles per hour winds for a period of about 6 hours, much of which that time was spent in a half bath after losing part of my roof, bracing a door with my brother, with water coming in, and the winds just wreaking havoc on your home. I can only imagine what those persons in the Bahamas and many of my colleagues in the Carolina community have experienced going through Hurricane Dorian. So this is a critical moment for them, and I think this is a great initiative that is being undertaken. Likewise, as CEO of the Anguilla Electricity Company, going through the experience and waking up the next morning, facing the prospects of rebuilding a system, you can only imagine it's a very daunting experience and a daunting thing to face. It really was overwhelming. However, with the partnership of many in the region, through Carolina, with the partnership of many globally, the UK government and others, we were able to overcome that hardship and that difficult challenge. One of the great things that came out of that whole experience was the fact that we had to rethink the way we did things previously. We could not undergo the same experience and have the same outcome. And that's where IRMA came into play, where we worked closely with them to develop the Solar Under the Storm white paper. Essentially, we weren't afraid to go in and do the detailed analysis and studies to figure out how we can do this again and do it better. And I think a lot of the lessons learned are shared in there, so I'm not going to go into much of the detail. But essentially, this paper allowed us to set the template in a time of great need to rebuild in a way that made us more resilient, so that we don't have to face this experience each and every year we're threatened by a Category 5 or other storm. So I think it's a great opportunity to have to share this information with others at this point in time, and I think I'll leave it as that.
Thank you, David, for sharing that experience. Maybe just to zoom out a little bit, Rocky Mountain Institute is currently working with over 15 countries in the Caribbean. We do have a strong focus in the Bahamas, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but that we have several staff members deployed across the region in different capacities. Our normal operating procedures are designed around 3 essential pillars upstream energy planning that is done in an inclusive way to help countries define and realize their energy visions by developing detailed national energy transition strategies that identify the optimal combination of energy investments for a particular context. Taking those pipeline portfolios and de-risking projects to ensure that they are commercially viable and bankable, and bringing those to the market. And most importantly is building capacity at every step of the process. Our strategic partner in Kerelec hosts the Kerelec Renewable Energy Community, which is designed to share lessons between countries and bring in outside expertise to augment the local capacity to ensure that everyone has the appropriate information that they need to make informed decisions and are going through this journey together. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Owen Lewis, who is our operations manager, to speak specifically about the current portfolio of projects in the Bahamas prior to Hurricane Dorian hitting the Northern Islands. So it looks like Owen cannot join. Unfortunately, he's in listening mode. But to speak just very briefly about some of the activities that we've had in the Bahamas since 2014. The priority in the Bahamas has been transitioning the family islands, which comprise 21 islands across the archipelago, which actually includes Great Abaco, from antiquated diesel generation to solar plus storage. We've initiated that process in five islands prior to Hurricane Dorian hitting the northern island of Abaco and Grand Bahama. It is important to note that under phase 2 of that program, Abaco was earmarked to be transitioned, and obviously now that has been prioritized. In addition to that, following Hurricane Irma and Maria, Ragged Island in the southern Bahamas, similar situation to Abaco, much smaller island. All energy infrastructure was destroyed during that event, and working with the government of Bahamas and Bahamas Power and Light, we're able to design a renewable energy microgrid consisting of solar plus storage with some minimal diesel backup, designed to Cat 5 standards following the solar under storm recommendations. And we're happy to note that that project is underway. The contracts have been signed and the procurement process is underway. The picture that you're seeing here now is a 1 megawatt car park solar canopy. It is the largest in the CARICOM region from a solar car park canopy perspective, designed to Cat 5 standards. We do want to note that Dorian, this asset did not take a direct hit from Dorian. It was on the outer bands of the storm, so it did receive high-end tropical force winds. And we're happy to note that there was 0 damages, and it was producing power not only during the storm, but immediately afterwards. In addition to that, we've been partnered with the government to do solar rooftop projects across several buildings in Bahamas. So a long history of working in the Bahamas and have been fully embedded there for some time. Now, fast forward to 2 weeks ago, September 3rd, when Dorian hit. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the focus is on the humanitarian effort now. But the Prime Minister did mention yesterday that we are moving now into the recovery and soon into the reconstruction phase. The focus of this call to action is around the medium to long-term rebuild, parallel to the emergency power restoration process that is undergoing. As I mentioned earlier, we are happy to note that we are partnered with Kerelec, who has a mandate for deploying linesmen from utilities around the region to provide emergency support to restore the current system. We are actively fundraising to support Kerelec in those efforts through the mandate that they have to deploy these linesmen and restore power. Now, but as we we look at the emergency phase, we obviously have to, in parallel, look at the long-term restoration of power. Working with BPL and Abaco and working with IRMA, which is the utility in Grand Bahama, we have looked at how we build back better, essentially, a new distributed energy system that is lower cost and more resilient, and use this horrific event as an opportunity to leapfrog into a 21st century grid. So how does that process actually play out? First, you start with understanding what the phased load profile will be of the island over a period of time. So obviously, we have to understand that Abaco and Grand Bahama aren't going to go back to what it was the day before the storm. It's going to be a phased rebuild process, and to understand what generation needs are needed at each phase of that rebuilding is critical to better understand how much generation is needed at the appropriate time. Working with national stakeholders, we've already been in discussions with Bahamas Power and Light and the government to support them in thinking through how to optimally rebuild the system in these devastated islands. Once the understanding of what the generation capacity needs are, we'll then move into defining with the stakeholders what the optimal characteristics and criteria are for the future energy system. Examples of that can include, obviously, resiliency as a core criteria, least cost generation to ensure a low cost of electricity and then obviously reliability. Some combination of these has been the process that we've gone through in other islands, including British Virgin Islands, following Hurricane Irma and Maria. These criteria then essentially calibrate the models that we use to generate the optimal mix of energy investments for a particular island, which then defines the portfolio of investments that will be invested over time. And so that process is aimed to be undertaken in a very rapid way, but inclusive way, to ensure that it is owned by not only the utility and government, but more importantly, the people and businesses that hope to rebuild on these devastated islands. Following the generation of that report, we would then move quickly into looking at the prioritized set of investments and as quickly as possible de-risking those. And when I say de-risking, identifying where these assets will be located, ensuring that they will be located in, for example, not in a floodplain or in an area that was previously impacted by storm surge, that we understand the soil composition, that we understand any other types of outside influences that need to be incorporated into the design in order to de-risk that project, package it and aggregate it along with other projects in a tender document that would then go out to public bid to make the necessary energy investments for these specific islands. Obviously, throughout this entire process, we would aim to build the local capacity of Bahamas Power and Light to not only repeat this process in the future, but to essentially to manage this new energy system, as well as sharing these lessons more broadly through the CARICOM community. So this is essentially what we've laid out as the call to act, IRMA's call to action, together with and in partnership with Bahamas Power and Light and the government of Bahamas. We are seeking resources to help support this plan and to start moving forward, ideally within the next 6 to 8 weeks, once the situation has stabilized and we're able to make progress. So now, that is just a very brief overview. We will be moving into questions that have been posed by the attendees, and we've also received some questions previously as well that we'll be happy to address. So the first question that we've received is, what reports do we have of solar systems and other renewable infrastructure surviving the storm? Well, obviously, when you get a 25-foot storm surge, it is very difficult to assess, you know, the survivability of such assets. We do not have any specific information on any ground mount systems. We do know that there was some rooftop systems on the island, obviously being with these structures obviously being compromised. As I mentioned earlier, obviously somewhat anecdotally, the system that was installed on Nassau, which was designed to Cat 5, did survive the tropical storm force winds. It is important to note that Nassau did, for the most part, lose power while that asset was still generating power throughout. In addition to that, we should have further data once the microgrid system on Ragged Island is constructed and operational, and then we'll have further data once, obviously, if that system takes a direct hit further on. The next question that we received is, what do we estimate as the cost to undertake this call to action? From our experience in the British Virgin Islands, to do this across 2 islands, which would be Grand Bahama and on Abaco, to both run the rapid integrated planning process to identify the optimal new investments, generation investments for these 2 islands, as well as de-risk an initial cohort of renewable energy projects that would be put out to bid, would cost in the amount of somewhere around 1.3 million US dollars. The next question we've gotten here is, how do we see what's happened in the Bahamas offering insights or what lessons can be learned from across the Caribbean? I think this is a really good question. David, I would ask you maybe to also jump in here as well, but I think from our perspective, I think the lessons learned here is that, one, as we mentioned earlier, that the inherent system architecture in the Caribbean of a centralized fossil fuel generated system with long transmission distribution lines is inherently vulnerable to the climate reality. Yes. And that these will continue to happen. Yes. And that moving to a more decentralized generation architecture where generation is closer to load, right? So you don't have this long transmission distribution system, coupled with the use of indigenous resources, will inherently make a more resilient system, right? Yes.
And no question about it, decentralizes the risk and improves the responsiveness of the system. So when the system that is totally dependent on a centralized generation point, if that generation point is compromised, the entire island is compromised. Decentralizing it allows the opportunity for the risk to be also decentralized and spread. So hands down, it's a much better approach, and that's what's the significance. And also even rebuilding the larger scale solar farms, solar on the storm, it allowed us to basically look at the construction standards and build it to a higher grade, category 5, which was breaking up a lot of new ground. So there were a lot of new concepts, a lot of new things, and just the engineering studies that came out of that allowed us to rethink how we would basically rebuild all solar farms going forward throughout the region.
Interesting. And another question that we've got in here is, you know, beyond solar and battery storage, right? What other clean energy investments can be made, such as wind? And is it possible to also ensure that those assets can be built to Cat 5 standards?
Yes, and there's some new construction engineering for wind farms that is happening. There are certain things that have improved their resiliency over the years. Ensuring that they are Cat 5 resilient is going to be the key test, and I think that's a role that IRMA can play.
Great, thank you, David. The next question we got is, what lessons can be learned from Hurricane Maria, and what has Puerto Rico and specifically done from an energy perspective to be more resilient? Maybe David, I'll start with you in terms of what lessons that we can learn from Hurricane Maria from the utility community, and then I can maybe touch on a little bit of what we've learned in Puerto Rico through our work there.
Sure, and I'll keep it in terms of the renewable energy context, because there are a lot of lessons learned across the board in terms of resiliency and capacity rebuilding in this case. But essentially for all the islands, including Puerto Rico, one of the things that we have to really look at is our critical infrastructure and how we could basically make our critical infrastructure more resilient throughout the island. So if you focus on the energy aspects of that, we talk about integrating distributed solar. We talk about higher standards for the solar farm construction. And obviously, one of the obvious things would be undergrounding any transmission and distribution system that complements that. So we're talking essentially about the future, but we know that we do have existing systems that have to be measured and managed in some capacity at this point.
So on the undergrounding note, before we maybe go into Puerto Rico, I think one thing that we realized about, obviously that is kind of the go-to, right? Traditional, like just underground everything. But the cost to underground everything can often be 7-8 times what the cost to actually rebuild the system. 10 times, right? So I think it's important for people to know that undergrounding everything is not the most cost-effective solution in most cases.
It's not practical from a time standpoint. You can't underground everything tomorrow.
Right.
And that's something that you can start, because it's going to take time to do a lot of the rebuilding that you need. So you start with your critical areas, your critical facilities, and make sure those are resilient. But we have to also integrate microgrids and renewable energy that is distributed so that these systems can survive independent of that grid. We're talking about a 20-year, 30-year exercise for undergrounding without immediate funding. It could even take longer.
Yeah, and I think this point, and I think this ties into the question around Puerto Rico, is that one lesson that we've learned, right, through Hurricane Maria and Irma, is that the initial impacts of the hurricanes or storm surge aren't what causes the most death, essentially. It's the lack of services which are tied to the energy system, and when those systems are disrupted, health systems, water treatment systems, telecommunication systems, when the economic impacts actually come in later on around, the banking systems not being able to operate. And we were in BVI, you couldn't go to the ATM for 2 months, right?
Fuel.
Yeah, fuel.
Get fuel to that because the bunker system might be compromised. Fuel cost goes up tremendously.
Right.
You're hopefully going to get it, because in those contexts, if the facilities, both the ports and docking facilities are compromised, all that becomes a question mark. And you got to think about, we were thinking about bringing in barges that could basically go on shore and roll off equipment and fuel and so forth. Those are a lot of things that are highly technical, highly costly, and we just need a better way to get it done.
Yeah, and so this is, I think, one of the main learnings that we've not only taken from Puerto Rico, but others, is having a focus on microgrids for critical facilities and services, right? So looking at your health facilities, your water treatment facilities, your telecommunication facilities, and ensuring that those systems have microgrids that are tied to the grid and can contribute to a lower operating cost. So it's not a sunk cost like a diesel generators that sits there. It's actually lowering your operating cost during normal times of operation. But when the grid is compromised, those systems can operate independently and still produce those critical services. And I think this is something that we've spoken with Bahamas Power and Light with, that the focus of the rebuild and the redesign in Grand Bahama and Abaco will essentially focus on concentrating the generation build out, starting with those critical facilities. So that's where the new system architecture will essentially build out from the critical facilities themselves to support other infrastructure.
And what you said exactly is very important. I'll put it in real context. When we were rebuilding our grid, it was going to take us easily 30 to 40 days to get to a particular area, tourism district, I'll call it. And this one segment of the tourism sector, a number of hotels were very close together and available and ready to receive customers in tourism and help to revive the economy of the island. But we weren't going to be able to get there for some time. So they were considering, we were considering actually putting in a mobile system and supplying just that particular area until we could get there at a later point in time. Well, the microgrid context, if there was something smaller immediately available with battery storage that could help facilitate something like that, it could come back on stream very quickly and would take out or put back on the grid or electrify a significant percentage of the economy, the economic engine of the island.
Right. And so we spoke obviously about the importance of microgrids. We've talked about them on Ragged Island and smaller islands, right, where it's a high cost of producing electricity because of that very expensive diesel supply chain. We've talked about microgrids for critical facilities, right, having a grid-tied microgrid that can also operate independently. What other role in the utility community do you see microgrids playing as we look to rebuild in Abaco and Grand Bahama, but also as we transition the other islands that weren't impacted by this specific disaster?
In the Anguilla context, we have a large part of the island that is served, and it's back to the same district where a lot of the hotels reside, that we have a long transmission line sending power to. There are losses along that transmission line, and we have one centralized plant. So having that microgrid helps us to stabilize the quality of power in that area, helps us to reduce the cost of providing power to that area, and also from a resiliency standpoint, helps us to spread our risk. So all around, it's a win-win.
Right. And so another question that we've just received from the audience, which I think is an important one, is what role, we talked about obviously solar in the storm, right? What additional role do you see RMI playing to support utilities in looking at how they plan and invest in not only the energy rebuild, right, in the countries hurt by Irma and Maria, and now with Dorian, but also in the transition?
Yeah, that's why I'm a bit emotional about this discussion, because it brings back a lot of memories. But beyond that, this alone is a big step. This alone helps us to get the resources and gather resources and raise funds to. And let me tell you, something as simple as the linesmen that are working to restore this grid, who are dedicated, passionate about the work they're doing it day and night. The little things, the water, the food, the cheering, the celebration, those are the things that really is going to help rebuild the system and rebuild the people. It really is almost therapeutic in a way, right? So this call alone helps us to get closer to those type of things. Beyond that, the technical expertise that RMI brings to the table, the relationships that RMI has that allows us to lean on various expertise to simple things, because as CEO of the utility, a lot of pressure to rebuild the system. Customers are on you every day. You don't have time to go out there and think about how we're going to rebuild our solar farm. It's devastated. And to get to that, we need the support, we need the knowledge, we need the expertise to come in and basically ease that pressure so that we can focus on the people things and rebuilding our lives. Okay. So I think this alone goes a very long way.
So I spoke earlier about, and this is another question from the audience, which I think is a very important one, around timing, right? After Irma and Maria, we can honestly say that many countries are still rebuilding 2 years later.
Yes.
Right? That while there has been progress made, it's been mostly made in an ad hoc fashion with some planning, but that many of these projects planned are still not up and operational. Realistically, what do we think the time frame will be to rebuild Abaco and Grand Bahama in this context?
Well, I think in my presentation, I talked a little bit about the differences. Each storm is somewhat different, the characteristics, and I couldn't imagine being under the effects of a storm of this size and magnitude for 30 plus hours. So it's very hard to gauge, and looking at just the level of devastation that some of the pictures on screen show, this is going to take a long time. But what is critical is that the people that are there are not suffering, and the human capacity to go beyond the experience of that is short and is limited. So we need to provide as much support as possible immediately. Now, it may not be back to where it was, a month ago. For years to come, I'm thinking probably 10 years minimum to get back to a reasonable standard of things, because a lot of times the interest dies out. So it lasts for about 6 months, a year, and then it dies out and people are left to continue rebuilding. But this level of devastation is going to take a long time.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, one thing that's interesting here is that, in responding to Antigua and Barbuda, particularly Barbuda, in responding to British Virgin Islands and responding to Puerto Rico, those weren't areas where we had boots on the ground already. We had not, IRMA had not been fully invested in those countries prior to the storm. So it took time to mobilize, build the relationships, and get things moving. Whereas in the Bahamas, there was already a plan to transition to Abaco, right? We've been operating there for now 5 years. We've deployed several projects in the ground. So at least from our perspective, we feel that at least that ramp up phase can happen much more quickly, right? Because we already have those relationships. There's already a plan in place. There's a mandate to do this work, right? Which we hope will truncate some of those timelines. But obviously, given the devastation that you said here, the humanitarian phase is critical, right? And making sure those people have the resources. But in parallel, let's start thinking through that long term. But we do think that we can truncate that long-term restoration because of the embeddedness of not only Rocky Mountain Institute, but other organizations as well, given the priorities of the government.
Yes. And I think the infrastructure aspect of it, despite the tragedy, you do get a period of time because just the sheer devastation of the homes have to rebuild. You talk about the planning, the stages and the phases of the load return. So you get some time to properly map it out and stage each point or each phase.
Yeah, no, that's great. I do want to mention that Solar Under Storm, the report that we referenced, that does provide a how-to to design and construct ground mount solar PV projects to Cat 5 is available on Rocky Mountain Institute's website. I also want to point out that we are in the process of coming out with a phase 2, next edition of Solar Under Storm that includes rooftop PV installations as well, to ensure that those are constructed to withstand these types of storms, given that we know that this is now the new reality. We're not going to move back. I mean, this is going to continue to happen. And by moving towards more decentralized, more resilient, renewable energy generation that are designed to withstand these types of impacts, we will create collectively a more resilient Caribbean. We also encourage everyone to visit the website. And again, if you are interested in donating and getting involved in the humanitarian phase, please follow the links that we provided. The Red Cross is also very active. And again, appreciate everyone's support during this process. The ultimate goal here is that the Northern Bahamas build back better to a more vibrant, more resilient, more economically sound community. And until then, our hearts and prayers are with those that have been affected and their family and friends. On behalf of Rocky Mountain Institute, just want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. We do apologize for the delay, but we hope that this was a lively discussion for you to help contextualize what is going on. And again, the questions that we were not able to address during the webinar will be addressed in writing through a subsequent follow-up email to everyone. So once again, thank you everyone, and have a great weekend.